I'm Renata Stewart.
And I'm Katie Bureau.
And we're here to talk to you about home electrification and grid flexibility in the Texas market. We come to this topic from sort of two different angles. I've been working with a clean energy startup for the last year and a half, focused on home electrification, and I've become really interested in the ways that electrified homes can become grid assets for a renewable grid.
And I am from Texas. I actually come from a traditional energy background, and I'm interested in how these technologies will play in the energy transition.
So we're going to start by sort of breaking apart our thesis statement that we have refined over the last couple of months together, which will act as a little bit of a guide to the next 12 minutes. So distributed energy resources, or DERs, have the potential to help accelerate the adoption of renewables and stabilize the grid through their ability to add critical flexibility to balance supply and demand. When electrified and connected, homes everywhere have the potential to be a really powerful DER. The unique Texas energy market, which we'll talk a lot about, holds a lot of monetary value for DERs, but the adoption of the electric appliances that could act as those DERs is lagging, we found. So we're exploring the reasons why and proposing a set of solutions to bridge that gap. To ground us all in some market trends that are important to this, there is unprecedented load growth on the grid right now. This is due to primarily data center demand, the electrification of transportation and buildings, and the onshoring of manufacturing. We just need more electricity delivered. The good news is that a lot of this electricity that's being delivered is coming online in the form of renewables. As many of you know, the cost curve of renewables, particularly solar, is coming way down very quickly. And so in many places, often the cheapest form of electricity is solar. Solar has an issue, though, in that it's intermittent, which is sort of defined by the duck curve that somebody mentioned earlier. So this basically means that the middle of the day, the sun is shining, there's a lot of solar energy, stress on the grid is low, but at the same time that people are coming home using more electricity, there's less solar capacity, which leads to a lot of stress at the grids at peak time. So utilities and market generators of electricity are sort of building for that peak, building oversized, expensive generation. DERs can provide critical supply and demand stabilization throughout the day to help mitigate the stress on the grid. But not all DERs are created equal. So in our survey of the landscape, we've sort of categorized them into three different types of DERs. The first is supply side. So think rooftop solar, small scale wind that can inject energy into the grid when demand is high. They're bidirectional DERs, so think home batteries, vehicle batteries that can consume and supply and dispatch energy back to the grid as needed. And then there are demand DERs, demand side DERs, which is where we'll focus today, which can reduce or shift energy demand to align with grid needs, often in real time. So this think smart thermostats, electric appliances, a sort of new wave of connected devices in the home. Texas is actually really primed for a DER adoption wave, and this is due to three critical factors. The Texas energy market, known as ERCOT, is singularly unique in the US in that it's both a deregulated market and an energy-first market, which means it relies primarily on live price signals for demand and supply of electricity. This allows, for example, batteries to actually capitalize on price arbitrage. So providers of energy can buy energy when it's low, store it, sell it back to the grid when it's high. ERCOT and the Texas market also has a surprisingly high penetration of renewables. This is both due to Texas's sort of natural resources, has a lot of solar and wind, and as they come down the cost curve and there's a sort of free market for electricity generation, the cheapest forms of electricity, namely solar, really thrive in Texas. And then frequent extreme weather events and very public, sort of visceral ones have elevated a sort of like cultural and consumer consciousness about the need for grid resiliency. So those market trends have really led to like a huge cropping up of home battery, supply side DER companies, many of which we talked to through this project. But there is a lack of investment in the demand side DERs, which is what I will hand it over to Katie to talk about.
Yay. All right. Ooh, wrong direction. So we believe, based on our research and modeling, that the next great wave in the energy energy transition in Texas will be with demand response technologies. We decided to specifically focus on water heaters because they have the unique ability to act as thermal batteries at the home level and provide critical grid flexibility. So during our research, we identified 4 key barriers as to why there's been a lack of adoption in Texas, and these will need to be addressed if we want to see meaningful technology on the grid. The first and foremost is regulatory barriers that are preventing utility companies from directly offering demand response programs. We're also seeing market dynamics incentivize generation over efficiency. We're seeing limited customer awareness and cost barriers. Thankfully, there are various solutions that are in the works at the state Senate level and at the market level with DER task force that are tackling the first 2. So our project focused on solutions in the last 2 buckets. So working on how do we tackle limited customer awareness and overcoming cost barriers. So the methodology for our project was essentially a 3-pronged approach. We first did a ton of expert interviews talking to experts in the DER space and stakeholders across the Texas value chain. Next, we did secondary desktop research, reading white papers from industry, academic papers, and news articles. And finally, we did cost and emissions modeling of water heating at the household and the grid level, which I'll talk to y'all about next. So again, the reason why water heating is so interesting is because of this both demand response and grid flexibility. So when sun is shining, peak noon generation, you're able to heat up the water at the home. And then because of this awesome new hybrid heat pump technology, you have this incredible efficiency that can keep it hot all day long for that peak usage hour when people come home at the end of the day and are using a lot of hot water. So when we actually did a landscape of the different water heating technologies in Texas, something that was really interesting that stuck out to us was that conventional storage systems are 90% of what Texas households are using today. And this makes sense to us because this is the oldest technology on the market. Contractors are used to installing these, and it's going to be their first recommendation because it's the easiest and cheapest for them to install, which we'll see in a bit. And people, these have lifetimes of like 15 years, so people are really only making this decision every other decade. Okay, so this is the basis for our cost modeling analysis. Lots of color here, but what I want us to focus on right now is this key takeaway that consumers are hinging decisions based on this upfront cost. We have the lowest costs, the lowest sticker price for conventional storage, whether it's gas or electric, and so that's what they're gonna go with. But based on our modeling, we discovered that water heaters win not only on total lifetime cost, but also on total lifetime emissions, which makes it the clear winner from a decision perspective. But why is there that mismatch when consumers are actually going to make that decision? We actually believe that the solution here is to find ways where consumers really feel that value up front, whether that's business plans that are incentivizing loans, tools that allow you to unlock instant rebates and bring those up to the forefront when you're making that decision to purchase. So we know that water heaters are the highest lifetime value for consumers. We know that they're the lowest emissions, and we know that they provide an incredible flexibility to the grid. So why wouldn't these completely overtake the Texas market? Well, we've identified 4 key risks to rolling out a demand response program. The first of which being a Trump administration, which favors the gas industry. Second of which is different cultural nuances that place value on energy resilience over emissions, total emissions. Then we have a general lack of state level incentives and rebates. And finally, probably the most critical piece is an educational gap in contractor installation. So they've been used to installing conventional storage systems for the last 30 years. How do we get them educated on what these new systems entail and the technicalities in actually installing those in homes? But our theory of change is that starting with appliances like water heaters, we can drive the widespread adoption of demand response technologies in Texas, which will, one, reduce residential emissions meaningfully, and two, enable a renewable grid. And we are super excited to be partnering with these stakeholders to be rolling out our solution and consulting them on how to actually implement these changes in the market. So what's next for us? I am actually going to be joining a company with Alpine investors that is looking at building systems, and it has an energy efficiency component. So this is super, super applicable to what is going to need to be my skill set in the field.
And I will be continuing my work with Ensemble, the clean energy startup, where we are enabling contractors to have the decision to swap out the water heater to a heat pump, the easiest one, given what we've learned about that being a critical place of friction.
Yay. Oh, and we will take any questions.
Super fascinating that it is lowest cost and lowest emissions. If you take a step back and think about what this means for grid resiliency as a whole in Texas, I'd love to hear if you have any findings there.
Yeah, great question. We actually didn't believe that we had the time to cover our grid model in this presentation, so super happy to go over that today. So off the top of the noggin, the ability for the grid to flex a meaningful amount of gigawatt is highly, highly valued. And with a 100%, we have these couple different scenarios. With 100% achievement of a demand response program across 85% of homes in Texas, you can actually shift 10 gigawatt hours of power a day in Texas. I mean, we're talking huge amounts of power, which equates to, if you're shifting this to peak renewable hours, it's about like 9,000 metric tons of carbon per day. So this is quite substantial. And how that plays into resiliency, I think like the more, and would love your input too, but the more ability you have for a grid to be flexible, they can actually adjust to these extreme weather events that Texas has seen multiple this year alone. So it's kind of this flywheel effect where the more flexible demand responding technologies you have interacting on the grid level, the ability you have to pivot and adjust to these like black swan events that are becoming more and more apparent.
Yeah, I'm really glad we went after Frances, because I think her point about how this looks very different in different parts of the country is really important here. Like, this is particularly true in Texas because of its high penetration of renewables. And so there's this like inherent tension of you electrify more, you put more strain on the grid to decarbonize, but then there's that tension that we talked about at the beginning. So I think that because of the generation inputs into the Texas grid, there's that like, it's a little bit more of a win-win. And then also, and it's still low, but there's also a thesis that like as storage becomes adopted at a much higher rate in Texas than it does elsewhere, that is able to sort of like increase the impact of these electrified appliances' ability to shift, because you can just store with a battery in a home or an EV charger plugged in. So I think like both renewable generation and like storage adoption, because of the resiliency needs in Texas, like make adoption of electric appliances more fit for purpose for grid resiliency in Texas. That makes sense.
You talked a little bit about the cultural nuances in Texas. This decision sounds like it's really made like at the individual consumer level. Like, I'm buying a house, what model do I want to put in? Given the cultural nuances in Texas, can you maybe expand on that a little bit? Like, what do you think needs to be told to the consumers for them to make the quote unquote right decision based on your model?
Yeah, I think we have a great example of this kind of like marketing, how do you interact with consumers from Base Power. They're a company that is doing actually this like residential battery asset price arbitrage. So they are installing batteries at the household level, and then they own, so it's $0 upfront for the consumer to put a battery on their home. They just have to sign a contract for a meaningful amount of time with Base Power as their utility. And the way Base is making money is essentially storing power when it's very cheap during the day, and then offloading that to the consumer, or offloading that back to the grid or to the consumer when it's high priced, so they can like keep price very stable. And I think like for them, their sell to consumers is like, this helps you with like 98% of power outages that occur in Texas. So resiliency is key for Texas consumers. And this is by far the cheapest, we're the cheapest energy retailer on the market. And those two things are what are getting Texas consumers to sign with them. I think the like emissions component, we haven't seen that as something that's as critical as maybe like a Californian resident. But I think that it's still like something that maybe could come down the line later. So
yeah,
really great question.
What I think is true everywhere is people just want hot water 24/7. And I think the fear of an extreme weather event happening and that them not having access to that is more visceral. And what we learned through the interviews is that consumers in Texas are actually willing to pay a little bit of a premium for that in a way that's actually just not totally true yet elsewhere.
Great job. I'm super curious, like in terms of the cost like difference between conventional and heat pump, like what is the split between like just pure energy efficiency versus you get a better rate because you're using electric, and like incentives or like from being in parts of DER programs? Like where is the like juice actually?
Yeah, so what were you gonna say? No, you go for it. Yeah. Okay, I will go for it. So that is baked into the details of our model that is not fully captured in this presentation. I would say, so we did definitely factor in rebates and incentives on the heat pump perspective. In Texas, those are only at the federal level, and so it was like a couple $1,000. It was $1,750 upfront, not anything like super meaningful when you look at like the pretty big sticker price. And really it was, as far as like efficiency long-term, that was baked into more of that like OpEx perspective, which was like a couple rows down. And you see that like these conventional storage systems, these tanks are just like, they're just not as efficient. And so those, like the gas price and the energy or the electricity price that's factored into that model is just so much higher than when you look at like tankless gas, which is much more efficient from that perspective, and like heat pump water heaters. So yes, baked into those differences are all baked into that chart that we showed earlier. So
you can mostly see it. Electric storage versus heat pump storage are both electric, use the same like sort of input to plug, and it's the efficiency that drives the OpEx is the main thing. And we didn't model in any of the DER savings because it's actually outlawed for utilities to actually actively add DER savings. Some retail energy providers can just build in that savings to offer a lower rate. So, well, thank you.